So one thing to go over, trade is something that even players with 1,000+ hours, a lot of them still don't understand trade. A lot of them just kind of go wherever the numbers are biggest and call it good. I myself didn't actually even understand trade until I was at about 2,000 hours into Europa, when I forced myself to really start looking into it and figuring it out. Trade is something that seems super complicated, but in the end, really isn't. So this map right here, this is all of your different trade nodes. So this shows all these different named areas are a specific trade node, where all the trade in that area contributes toward their trade centers and the amount of money you can get in that node. So all the trade nodes of the world are connected in one way or another. But in the end, all of your trade flows into one of three end nodes. So an end node is a trade node where you see all these arrows coming in. These are what I generally refer to as trade rivers or streams. So these are kind of, streams or rivers of trade all coming in, but you see no arrows pointing out. Whereas if you look at, let's say, Constantinople, you see these arrows all coming in and one going out. So that means trade from Constantinople, it has a lot coming in, but then it still has a river flowing out to another trade node over here in Ragusa, which also then flows out in two different ways. So your end nodes are nodes where no trade leaves. Once it enters, it never goes away. All your trade that comes into these nodes, 100% just goes toward that node's trade income. So end nodes are the absolute best nodes you can have in the game, bar none. These are the best nodes to have if you can help it, because you can eventually direct all trade in the world into one of these three nodes. That being said, just for quick reference, your best node in the game starting out is Genoa, which you can see based on its value here, the trade value, the amount of trade that's available there. And then of course you have the channel up here, you have Venice, which are your other two end nodes. All three are very good nodes to have control of, but Genoa starts out as the richest. In the end, Genoa is the second best trade node in the world, simply because you can eventually get more trade going into the channel than any other end node. Because eventually you could focus more of the different trade nodes from around the world directing to the channel than you can to Genoa. I think it's either 3 or 4 more nodes from across the world go into the channel than go into Genoa. But either one is a perfectly fine node to have as your final end node to push all your trade into. Anyway, so that's just a basic overview of what end nodes are, if you ever hear them referenced. And those are the 3 end nodes in the game. Beyond that, Constantinople and Lubeck are some of your other best nodes in the beginning, and some of your best nodes to even have as end nodes. You're perfectly fine if those are your end nodes and you never actually push to one of the other 3. And that's because they have lots and lots of trade. Like the Silk Road comes through this region. People historically heard of the Silk Road, which was through this region here, trade coming from India and Asia over to Europe, and of course Middle Eastern trade coming over to Europe. A lot of trade flows through this region and makes Constantinople a very rich trade node. And since we're Ottomans, obviously we're going to be focusing on Constantinople right now. So what we see is we have these rivers of trade flowing into Constantinople, and those are what we want to focus on when you're going to be doing messing with your merchants. Now, everyone starts out with at least 1 merchant, 2, I believe, actually, if your base. Yeah, it shows right there. So everyone has at least 2 merchants available. Some have more than others based on national ideas, etc. Like Venice starts out with an extra merchant because of who they are. Anyways, we start out with 2, so we check, and we start out with Aleppo and Alexandria, both pushing trade toward Constantinople. What we're going to be worrying about over here when we're messing with all this stuff is we're going to be worried about the value and our current trade power. Those are your big things that you're going to be focused on. The more value that you have and the more trade power you have, the more you can push toward your home node. You also want to focus on, whenever you're using a merchant, you never want to send them to a node that has a blue arrow. So a blue arrow shows a node that is downstream from your home trade node, from the node you're collecting from. If it's downstream, you can't send, just like you can't send water back upstream, you can't send trade back upstream either. Once it's gone downstream, that's it. That's why end nodes are such a big deal. So this right here is sending trade downstream to Ragusa. So you don't want to try to put a merchant there because there's no point. They can't send trade back to Constantinople from Ragusa. So instead, you want the other nodes that are sending stuff downstream to Constantinople, which is Alexandria and Aleppo right now. The other node that it's showing here is Crimea, but Crimea is not as valuable as these two nodes. This one shows it has less trade value than Crimea right now, but if you look at it, here's Aleppo's total trade value in the node versus Crimea's total trade value. So since we have equal trade power in both of them, we want to go from the one that has more trade value because overall we'll get more money from that node into our home node. So those are the two things that you really want to look at, is you want to kind of balance how much trade power you have versus how much value is in that node. Let's say, see Genoa here has 18. So that 18, we have 0 trade power, but that's a hell of a lot of value. So if we were looking, if Genoa could come downstream to us, we'd want to send a merchant here because 22 trade power honestly isn't very much. So with how much more trade value there is in this node, it would be much more worthwhile for us to send a merchant here to downstream to our home node than it would be to Crimea or Astrakhan, any of these smaller nodes, because they're just there's so little trade value in them compared to what's in, say, Genoa. So that's just kind of balances you have to have. And if you're worried about it and if you're not sure, wait a second, what if I send a Wien, versus Kiev, but I have 30, trade power in Kiev versus 0 trade power in Wien? Experiment with it. Every single month, it'll update your income once that merchant has arrived. And so what you can do, if you're not sure, send a merchant there. Send one of your merchants to send downstream to your trade node, and then watch how your trade value changes. That will really tell you, and then you can kind of get a feel. And this is literally what I did to figure out trade, is I just started getting a feel for trade power versus the value in the node. And some people try to argue, if you're a nation, like over in Poland, or if you're in nations that have very low value trade nodes, a lot of people try to say, well, you should take one of your merchants rather than pushing value downstream and collect from your home node. And I understand why they say that, because your merchant adds a little bit of trade power. And so you're going to get a little bit more money collecting from your home node, because I get an income of 6.13. But the problem is that you're already collecting from your node. So all that merchant is doing is adding a little bit to your trade power. Versus the merchant pushing trade downstream is 99% of the time going to be better than trying to have a merchant collecting from your home node. Well, I can't say 99, probably 95% of the time. It's almost always better to push trade value downstream unless that trade value is like 1. Like Tunis, it's still probably better to push from Tunis than it is to collect from your home trade node if that was able to go downstream. But once again, this is something you can experiment with to find out. But like I said, probably 95% of the time, or at least 9 times out of 10, it's always best to have your merchants pushing downstream rather than taking one of them and putting it to collect in your home node and add just that little extra trade power. The other time that you're going to be doing something different with your merchants is, let's say Ragusa here, even though it's downstream, let's say Ragusa had a trade value of, Genoa's trade value. Let's say that had an 18 trade value. That's a lot of money. And since I do have trade power there, that would be something to consider rather than, let's say, this trader right here getting Aleppo with 0.55 value added to my trade. I might consider instead sending my merchant to collect from trade over here from Aleppo. Because if this had a value of 18, that's a lot of money. And with the trade power I have there, it's almost guaranteed I'd be collecting more than the 0.55 I'm pushing downstream from Aleppo. Just with 18 trade is a lot of trade starting out. And you'll eventually have trade nodes that are 300, 400 for their value. So, but anyways, and yeah, Mr. Cia, that is a good secondary point. But the whole point is, you never want to, just because some place has higher trade, you don't want to just send somebody to collect from there. That's a mistake I see people do all the time when they're starting out with trade is they try to collect everywhere. You rarely want your merchants collecting. And the reason why you want it to be such a high value before they collect is because when you send a merchant to collect in a node that's not your home trade node, they get a 50% penalty to their collection, to their merchant, to the power they add to the node, everything else. They take a 50% penalty to that. And so that's why you don't want to collect just because it's a little more valuable. You only want to collect if the node is quite a bit more valuable than the node they're pushing from. And we're not going to collect in Genoa because we have no trade value there. We would get almost nothing from it, even though it's so valuable. So, but anyways, so and that's kind of the lesson to learn is as you go on, keep trying to push trade downstream. As you take over new areas, like as I take over Persia and stuff, I'm going to keep pushing trade downstream. I'm going to keep transferring trade power. And you just want to follow the streams to know where you should push trade from. And then as you go on, the way you want to focus your merchants is, let's say, I were to get more value into Crimea. Let's say Crimea were to jump like up to 8. I'd switch my Aleppo merchant over to Crimea if they had about 8 trade value right now, because I'd get more trade out of it. And that's how you start adjusting your merchants over time, is you start going based on how valuable the trade in the node is, where you've expanded to. Like, let's say I were to fully expand into Ragusa, I could always consider pushing my trade all into Ragusa from Constantinople. Or let's say I conquered all the way into Venice. I could just make Venice my main trade node and then push all my trade forward into Venice to collect all the extra trade coming from other nodes. But that's just more advanced stuff down the road. Early on, when it comes to trade, that's just the things to know is focus on trying to push trade downstream 9 times out of 10. And it's simple from there. If you just think of this as water and you trying to force all the water into one spot, easiest way to really think about trade. So hope that's helpful. The only other part about trade I'll cover real quick is there are these centers of trade. Centers of trade can go from level 1 all the way up to level 3. Centers of trade specifically give you bonuses in that trade node, so they're very good to have. You can have level 2 centers of trade in any place that you have as a state. You can state up territories within your empire. Any place that you have as a state can have the level 1, level 2, level 3 centers of trade. If it's not a state in your empire, you cannot level up the trade centers. Trade centers cost money to level up. If I wanted to level up this trade center, like right here, I would have to have $1,000, as you can see right there. To level up from level 1 to 2 is 200, so it's actually a heck of a lot cheaper. I don't think I have any level 1 centers of trade, though. Nope, they're all level 2. Anyways, yeah, so you get those bonuses for leveling it up. A level 3 center of trade, you can only have as many level 3 centers of trade as you have merchants. So I can only have 2 right now. You want level 2 centers of trade wherever you can have them in your trade areas, but level 3s, you only want 1 per node. You don't need more than 1 per node at all. So you want the level 3 centers of trade specifically where they're going to give you the most value. The way you figure out for a level 3 center of trade the most value is how many states in the territory, and there are what's known as trade goods, which are down here on your panels. You want to see whatever has the most valuable trade goods plus the most states. And the reason for that is you get specific bonuses that are applied to the entire state when you get a level 3 center of trade. And so you want that applied as broadly as possible and to as many trade goods and valuable trade goods as possible. So it's kind of a balancing act of figuring out what has the most valuable trade goods and what has the best states for you to get those bonuses into. And that's more advanced things that you'll learn over time and you'll learn to look at over time. But it's just something to keep in mind right now. The best rule of thumb is pay attention to how many territories are in that state. Like this only has 3. So it's not the greatest, but if you look around, you're not going to find much more than that. You have 4 here. This would be a great place simply because it has 2 different centers of trade. So that could be a really good consideration also, is how many centers of trade are in a state if it has more than 1. But yeah, early on, see, like we have 5 territories here. So what we're going to do is look real quick at the trade goods. So value of 3, value of 3, salt, that's a good one, value of 3, value of 3, value of 3. So everything's worth 3 here, which is average. So it's not a terrible state right here to actually put a level 3 center of trade in, especially because it has 5 different states that it can affect. Now, the only other consideration, of course, is these are bad states for deving up. You see that development cost plus 5%, development cost plus 20%, and that's when you're leveling this up with monarch points. So that's another consideration, but a more advanced consideration to look at. Like I was saying, the easiest rule of thumb is generally just try to pay attention to how many states, at least from the very beginning. And then as you learn the game over time, start paying attention to the trade goods, paying attention to the type of terrain, stuff like that, and experiment with it. But yeah, this wouldn't be a bad level 3 center of trade, though my preferred level 3 center of trade for this region is up here in Wallachia, simply because it's 5 states and 4 of them are farms, which have a lower cost for development, so you can develop them up like crazy. So this is one of my preferred areas for a level 3 center of trade, even though the trade goods are lower, simply because it has 5 states and they're very, very easy to develop. Even grasslands are your second best areas to develop because there's no negatives toward developing it. So this is probably my favorite place to put a level 3 center of trade for Constantinople. Anyways, yeah, so that's the centers of trade. Like I said, they give you bonuses that you can read on the centers of trade themselves. And you want to keep them as high level as possible, and limit your level 3s to 1 per trade node. And only specifically, I should say, in trade nodes that are very important to you. Ragusa, I wouldn't put a level 3 center of trade in right now because I'm not doing anything with it with my traders. I would be looking at a level 3 center of trade in Alexandria or Aleppo. And then, of course, Constantinople, my home trade node. So, anyways, that's a quick trade overview. If you want to ask more questions, you can feel free to hop on the channel and ask, specifically here on Twitch, since this is where I stream and live stream. Or you can also hop on my Discord using the command in Twitch. And yeah, just ask questions, and either I or somebody else generally in my Discord will get to the question and offer what advice we can.